The milk bottle itself, when produced from the scullery where it had apparently been deposited with all the ceremony of a medieval relic, was disappointingly ordinary. A standard glass vessel of the sort that had been delivered to English doorsteps since the turn of the century, bearing the faint legend Primrose Dairy, Ashford in weather-faded script. What rendered it extraordinary and indeed rather nauseating was its contents. The finger, undoubtedly human, undoubtedly severed with a degree of surgical precision that spoke either to professional knowledge or to an unusually steady hand during a moment of considerable passion, lay coiled in approximately 2 inches of milk like some obscene pearl in an oyster of dubious provenance. It was a right ring finger, Whimsy observed with the sort of detached clinical interest one might bring to examining a particularly interesting fossil, and the flesh had begun to discolor at the edges in a manner that suggested the amputation had occurred somewhere between 24 and 48 hours prior. There was, mercifully, very little blood. The milk had apparently been added after the fact, which suggested someone possessed of either unusual foresight or an unfortunate familiarity with the practicalities of preserving biological specimens. "Fascinating," Whimsy murmured, leaning closer without actually touching the thing. "You will note, Graves, the absence of any accompanying note, message, or explanatory addendum. Merely the finger and the milk, delivered with the morning's regular order. I don't suppose the milkman has been questioned." Graves admitted that the milkman, a young fellow named Pritchard, who had been making deliveries to the hall for approximately 18 months, was currently being located, though he had apparently made his rounds that morning before the discovery. The finger, therefore, must have been inserted into the bottle sometime between Pritchard's departure yesterday morning and the maid's horrified discovery this afternoon. A window of approximately 23 hours, Whimsy calculated, though whether the perpetrator was blessed with access to the house itself or merely to the front step remained a matter of speculation. He turned to address the gathered household staff. "I assume Mrs. Chatterton is aware of this development?" The ferret-faced maid, whose name Whimsy had learned was Miss Pickering and who appeared to occupy some ambiguous position between housemaid and personal assistant, nodded miserably. "She took it very badly, sir. She's resting in her sitting room. She says—" The girl hesitated, glancing at Graves as though seeking permission to continue. "She says she knows whose finger it is. She says it's her brother's." This revelation produced a rather profound silence, the sort of silence that Whimsy had learned to associate with moments when the fabric of polite pretense had been torn rather dramatically. He set down his cigarette with careful precision. "Her brother's finger," he repeated, as though the words themselves required examination. "How extraordinarily specific. One does not often receive one's brother's fingers in bottles of milk. It rather suggests either a degree of family discord that has progressed beyond the merely verbal, or an act of theatrical malice on the part of someone possessed of a peculiar sense of humor. I gather Mrs. Chatterton is not at present in a state to receive visitors?" Graves confirmed this assessment with a grave inclination of his head. "In that case," Whimsy continued, "I should very much like to know precisely where her brother is currently resident, whether he is known to have suffered any recent injuries of a mutilating nature, and what possible connection such a circumstance might have to the Chatterton household. Also, and I confess, this is merely incidental curiosity, whether the said brother is known to wear a ring on his ring finger, as the absence of any jewelry on the severed digit struck me as rather significant." The butler appeared momentarily nonplussed, a condition which Whimsy noted suited him not at all. "I'm afraid I don't take your meaning regarding the jewelry, sir." "No? Well, consider this. If someone amputates a finger for purposes of theatrical intimidation, they generally do one of two things. Either they leave the jewelry intact, thereby making identification considerably easier and rendering the whole exercise more genuinely threatening, as it suggests intimate knowledge of the victim's person. Or, and this is what we appear to have here, they remove the ring, which indicates either squeamishness regarding theft or foreknowledge that the jewelry would lead to immediate identification. In either case, it tells us something rather interesting about the psychology of our perpetrator. They want Mrs. Chatterton to know who has been injured, but they do not wish the police to discover the identity through conventional means. The message, in other words, is personal." He smiled without particular warmth. "I do hope the authorities arrive soon. I find myself developing an intense desire to meet Mrs. Chatterton's brother, or what remains of him, as the case may be. Also, we should perhaps inquire whether anyone in the household has observed any unusual visitors to the property in the past week, and whether anyone has noticed Mrs. Chatterton behaving in any manner whatsoever that might suggest prior knowledge of this singular delivery. Servants, I have found, observe considerably more than they are typically given credit for observing. Now then, Graves, shall we begin with the precise circumstances of Mrs. Chatterton?" "Discovery. I gather she did not discover it herself." "Mrs. Chatterton had not," Graves explained with the sort of careful precision that suggested he had already narrated this sequence of events to himself multiple times, discovered the bottle herself. That distinction belonged to Miss Pickering, who had been dispatched to collect the morning's delivery at approximately 11:30, having been delayed by a domestic matter involving the replacement of a torn hem on one of her mistress's dressing gowns. The bottle had been sitting undisturbed on the step since some time before breakfast, or so it appeared, though naturally one could not be entirely certain of such matters without having maintained constant visual surveillance, which would have been neither practical nor, one might argue, socially acceptable. Upon discovering the finger, Miss Pickering had naturally screamed, which had brought Mrs. Chatterton down from her sitting room with considerable haste. Mrs. Chatterton had examined the bottle, apparently confirmed the identity of the appendage through some means which Graves forbore to specify, and had then retired to her quarters in what could only be described as a state of considerable emotional disturbance. Wimsey found himself regarding Graves with increased interest. The man was being remarkably forthcoming, and more importantly, he was being organized about it, presenting facts in a logical sequence rather than the customary servant's tendency to begin 3 hours before the actual incident and work forward through a morass of tangential detail. Either Graves possessed an unusually orderly mind, or he had already considered the possibility that a crime had been committed and had mentally prepared his account accordingly. "And Mrs. Chatterton," Wimsey prompted, "made her identification how precisely? The finger is rather beyond the immediate recognitio. Of most people, I should think. One finger among all the fingers in England must surely present a considerable challenge to positive identification, unless there was some distinguishing feature, a peculiar scar, a notable deformity, a ring, as we have already discussed, that failed to materialize." Graves hesitated, a barely perceptible pause, but sufficient to indicate that he had reached the boundary of what he considered appropriate to reveal, without direct interrogation from Mrs. Chatterton herself. "I believe, sir, that Mrs. Chatterton recognized the ring that was absent. Her brother, Mr. Edmund Chatterton, has worn the same signet ring continuously for the past 7 years, to my knowledge. A family crest, rather distinctive, I believe, and Mrs. Chatterton was aware of its constant presence on his person. The absence, therefore, was rather conclusive as to identity." "Clever," Wimsey murmured. "The ring removed and discarded, or more likely, retained by whoever performed this rather surgical amputation. Tell me, when was Mr. Edmund Chatterton last observed in the company of members of this household? Not casually glimpsed in the village, but actually present at the hall?" The butler's reply came with admirable precision, precisely 6 days prior, on a Wednesday evening when Mr. Chatterton had dined at the hall with his sister. He had arrived by motor car at approximately 6 in the evening and had departed at approximately 11, having, according to the servants, who had prepared his dinner, appeared to be in somewhat strained spirits. There had been raised voices, though nothing that Graves himself had personally overheard, and Mr. Chatterton had subsequently been observed leaving rather more briskly than would be considered cordial. He had not been seen since, nor had Mrs. Chatterton made any inquiry regarding his whereabouts, which Graves noted with the sort of tactful delicacy that suggested considerable familiarity with the family's domestic complexities. "Not seen since Wednesday," Wimsey repeated, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in a gesture of intense concentration. "And today is Saturday, a gap of precisely 96 hours, which aligns rather neatly with our medical assessment regarding the condition of the finger. Tell me, Has anyone attempted to contact Mr. Chatterton in the interim? A telephone call, a letter, any effort whatsoever to establish his current whereabouts? Graves appeared momentarily uncomfortable. Mrs. Chatterton did not request that anyone do so, sir. It is not, I believe, uncommon for Mr. Chatterton to disappear for several days at a time. He maintains a flat in London, and his movements are, he paused delicately, not always immediately known to the household. This statement, innocuous as it appeared, hung in the air with considerable weight. Whimsy's expression shifted fractionally, not into alarm precisely, but into something more akin to intense amusement mixed with speculative interest. He rose from his chair with fluid grace and moved toward the window, from which the front drive of Chatterton Hall was visible in all its manicured mediocrity. Beyond the gravel sweep, the road descended toward the village proper, and further still, the railway station could be glimpsed through a veil of September foliage. "So we have," he said, speaking more to the window than to Graves, a gentleman who was accustomed to vanishing without explanation, who dined with his sister 6 days ago in what witnesses characterize as strained circumstances, who has failed to materialize since that time, and whose ring finger has arrived, neatly severed and preserved in dairy produce, as a calling card of extraordinary unpleasantness. One begins to develop a rather intriguing set of hypotheses. The first, natura. Lee, is that Mr. Chatterton has come into contact with someone motivated to cause him physical harm, a creditor perhaps, or an irate husband or father. The second possibility is considerably more theatrical, that the finger is not in fact Mr. Chatterton's at all, but merely a finger that Mrs. Chatterton has chosen to identify as such for reasons which remain opaque. And the third, he turned back to face Graves directly, is that we are dealing with a considerably more elaborate deception than any of these scenarios would suggest. Has the telephone exchange been instructed to connect the police directly to this house, or shall we make that arrangement ourselves? Inspector Cordwell arrived at Chatterton Hall at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which Whimsy judged to be a respectable response time, given that Little Crampton was situated some 8 miles from the nearest police station in Ashford proper. He was a man of perhaps 55, with the sort of stolid competence that comes from 25 years of dealing with rural crime, which is to say primarily poaching, minor theft, and the occasional domestic dispute that required official intervention. The finger in milk had clearly unsettled him, though he maintained the professional demeanor of someone accustomed to treating the extraordinary as merely a variation on the mundane. He was accompanied by Sergeant Pettigrew, a younger man with the eager expression of someone determined to learn his trade and the unfortunate tendency to take copious notes on matters that would have been better left unrecorded. Lord Peter Whimsy, Cordwell said on being introduced, and there was something in his inflection that suggested he was not entirely certain whether he was pleased or disappointed by this development. "I've heard of you, of course, though I confess I'd rather hoped this particular incident would rema in straightforward." His glance toward the milk bottle, now carefully contained in a glass jar by the parlor window, suggested that hope was rapidly evaporating. Whimsy smiled with genuine warmth. He had found, over years of unofficial investigation, that policemen responded rather better to charm than to condescension, particularly those of a conscientious disposition. "My dear Inspector," Whimsy said, gesturing toward a chair with the casual grace of someone who had forgotten he was in someone else's house, "I assure you my presence here is entirely coincidental. I am merely a guest in this house, driven by boredom and the autumn weather to accept an invitation from Mrs. Chatterton's cousin. I have not the slightest official capacity, and I defer entirely to your authority in these matters. Though I confess, having already begun to examine the circumstances, I find myself possessed of several observations which might prove marginally useful." Cordwell's expression suggested he had heard this particular speech before, probably from Whimsy himself or from accounts thereof related by other officers. Nevertheless, he settled into his chair with the air of a man resigned to hearing said observations, and Whimsy proceeded. The timeline, he began, was peculiar in several respects. Mr. Edmund Chatterton had dined at the Hall on Wednesday evening and had departed at 11 o'clock. His finger had arrived sometime between Thursday morning and Saturday afternoon, a span of nearly 70 hours, which raised the question of whether the amputation had occurred immediately after his departure or at some point in the intervening time. The preservation of the specimen in milk suggested someone with at least passing knowledge of how to maintain biological material, or, alternatively, someone who had simply seized upon the most readily available preservative at hand. The delivery itself was theatrical in nature. The use of the milk bottle implied either intimacy with the household's routine or observation, sufficiently detailed to determine the pattern of deliveries. The absence of accompanying note or explanation suggested the identity of the victim was sufficiently obvious to require no clarification, which narrowed the circle of likely perpetrators considerably. Furthermore, Whimsy continued, observing Cordwell's increasingly vertical eyebrows with amusement, the finger belongs to someone of some importance to Mrs. Chatterton, not merely emotionally, but psychologically. She identified it through the absence of a ring rather than through any conventional means. This suggests her relationship with her brother is sufficiently intimate that she knew, with absolute certainty, the precise state of his person at all times. One does not generally maintain such detailed knowledge of casual acquaintances, or even of siblings with whom one is not considerably close. Yet, according to your preliminary interviews, and I trust Graves has been forthcoming in this regard, the last contact between them involved raised voices and apparent discord. This is, Inspector, a contradiction of considerable interest. Either Mrs. Chatterton is significantly distressed regarding her brother's welfare despite their recent quarrel, or she is considerably more involved in this matter than her apparent shock would suggest. Cordwell leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in a gesture that mirrored Whimsy's own earlier posture. You're suggesting she sent the finger to herself? Why on earth would she do such a thing? Ah, but I haven't suggested anything of the sort, Whimsy replied with exaggerated innocence. I have merely noted that the facts, as they currently present themselves, contain certain internal contradictions. Whether those contradictions resolve into guilt, innocence, or something considerably more complex, remains entirely to be determined. What I would suggest, however, is that we speak directly with Mrs. Chatterton, not regarding what she has told you, but regarding what she has chosen not to tell you. I find that people are remarkably forthcoming about their secrets when one asks the correct questions. He rose smoothly. Shall we? I believe she is expecting you. Also, I should mention that I have already noted several peculiarities regarding the domestic arrangements at the Hall, peculiarities which may prove relevant. The library door, for instance, appears to have been very recently oiled, despite the fact that Graves claims no such maintenance has been performed, and the carpet in the corridor leading to the servants' stairs bears a curious mark, as though something rather heavy has been dragged across it within the past day or two. Small matters, perhaps, but small matters accumulate rather remarkably when one pays attention. Mrs. Chatterton received them in her sitting room with the sort of composed dignity that suggested either considerable emotional fortitude or the consumption of a judicious quantity of brandy approximately 30 minutes prior to their arrival. She was a woman of perhaps 48, with the sort of careful appearance that comes from maintaining oneself not out of vanity, but out of rigid habit. Her grey-blonde hair arranged with precision, her dress impeccable despite what must have been a deeply distressing morning. She did not rise from her chair when they entered, a small discourtesy that Whimsy noted with interest. It suggested either genuine incapacity or a deliberate assertion of her position as mistress of the household, unwilling to defer even to official authority. Inspector Cordwell introduced himself with appropriate formality, and Whimsy remained tactfully in the background, allowing the official interview to proceed as it naturally would. Mrs. Chatterton's account of the morning's discovery was consistent with Graves's version. Miss Pickering had collected the milk, screamed, and Mrs. Chatterton had been summoned. Upon seeing the finger, she had immediately recognized it as belonging to her brother Edmund, based upon the particular shape of the nail bed and the absence of his signet ring. She had no idea who could have perpetrated such a barbarous act, though she acknowledged that Edmund had always been somewhat careless with his associations. When pressed regarding the nature of his associations, she became deliberately vague, speaking of business matters and unfortunate entanglements, without specifying the precise nature of either. It was at this juncture that Whimsy, who had positioned himself near the mantelpiece with the air of someone merely observing proceedings, asked a question. "Mrs. Chatterton," he said with carefully modulated courtesy, "I wonder if you might clarify a small point. When you identified the finger as your brother's, you made reference to the absence of his ring as being determinative, yet surely a simple examination of the digit itself, the shape, the coloration, any distinctive marks, would be equally confirmatory. I find myself curious as to why you chose to emphasize the ring specifically, rather than the finger's own characteristics." Mrs. Chatterton's eyes flickered toward him with an expression that suggested she was reassessing his status from that of merely an eccentric houseguest to something rather more professionally dangerous. It simply seemed the most obvious distinguishing feature. Edmund has worn that ring continuously for years. Its absence is precisely what struck me as conclusive proof. But you see," Whimsy continued with the air of someone engaged in friendly philosophical debate, T is precisely what troubles me. One might expect a sister to recognize her brother's finger through intimate knowledge of its appearance. A childhood scar, a peculiar curve to the bone, any number of physical characteristics that would be familiar to someone who has known the person since birth. Yet you leap immediately to the absence of jewelry. It rather suggests that you were not, in fact, examining the finger itself at all, but were instead confirming an identity that you had already anticipated. Which raises the intriguing question of how one anticipates receiving one's brother's severed finger in a bottle of milk without prior knowledge that the amputation was imminent. Inspector Cordwell's attention sharpened considerably. Mrs. Chatterton had gone quite pale, though she maintained her composure with admirable restraint. "That is a preposterous suggestion, Mr. Whimsy. Surely you cannot imagine that I imagine very little," Whimsy interrupted gently, "and observe considerably more. What I observe, for instance, is that you have not asked whether your brother is alive or dead. You have not inquired as to his current location. You have not expressed any desire to contact him or confirm his safety. A sister receiving confirmation that her brother has been injured would typically, one might expect, demonstrate some concern for his welfare beyond the initial shock of the discovery. Yet you have done none of these things. Your distress appears to be anxiety of a rather different character, the anxiety of someone whose carefully constructed arrangement has encountered an unexpected complication. I insist you leave this house at once," Mrs. Chatterton said, her voice steady but with an undertone of genuine fear. Cordwell, however, raised a hand in a gesture that suggested he had not finished with the proceedings. "I think, Mrs. Chatterton," the inspector said slow, that we should perhaps discuss your brother's activities in rather more detail, and specifically his movements on the evening he dined here. You mentioned raised voices. I should like to know precisely what the nature of the disagreement was." Mrs. Chatterton's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a glass of water on the side table. "Edmund owes money to certain people, considerable sums. He believed I might be prevailed upon to assist him in meeting his obligations. I refused. He became angry. He left. That is all there is to say." Whimsy exchanged a glance with Cordwell, and in that glance passed an understanding that the surface of events was beginning to fracture, revealing something considerably more complex beneath. "And yet," Whimsy murmured, almost to himself, "the matter of that oiled library door troubles me still. One does not typically oil the hinges of a door unless one intends to move through it repeatedly without producing noise. And the mark on the carpet, such marks generally indicate that something has been dragged, not carried. A body, perhaps, or a large trunk. I find myself developing an increasingly uncomfortable hypothesis, Inspector. I wonder if you might arrange for a discreet search of the cellars. I suspect we may discover that Mr. Edmund Chatterton is considerably closer to his sister than anyone has thus far supposed, The cellars of Chatterton Hall were precisely the sort of Victorian Gothic fantasy that one might expect to find beneath a house of this period. Low ceilings, stone walls that wept with perpetual damp, and the sort of archaeological layering of domestic detritus that accumulates when a family has occupied a residence for more than a century without ever quite discarding anything. Inspector Cordwell had brought a constable with a torch, and they progressed through the gloom with the air of men descending into some particularly unpleasant archaeological dig. Wimsey followed at a slightly tangential angle, his attention apparently divided between the proceedings and his examination of the cellar walls themselves, running his fingers along the ancient stone with the air of a connoisseur examining a particularly inferior painting. It was in the third chamber, designated by some long-dead servant as the old wine cellar, though it had clearly been repurposed decades ago as a storage area for broken furniture and other domestic casualties, that Sergeant Pettigrew discovered the door. It was a small door, set into what appeared to be a solid wall, and it was only the constable's torch reflecting off an edge of relatively new wood that betrayed its presence at all. The hinges, Wimsey noted with satisfaction, were identical to those on the library door above, recently oiled, carefully maintained, and bearing the sort of meticulous attention that suggested regular use. Cordwell produced a key ring and, after several experimental attempts, located a key that opened it with almost surgical precision. Beyond the door lay a small room, barely larger than a closet in fact, which had apparently been converted into something approaching a prison cell. There was a simple cot, a chamber pot, a water pitcher, and a small table containing the remnants of what appeared to be several days' worth of meals. The air within was stale and heavy, with the unmistakable odor of human confinement, and on the cot lay Edmund Chatterton, or what remained of him. He was alive, which was the first surprise. He was conscious, which was the second, and he was missing his right ring finger, which was merely confirmatory of what they had already suspected. "Good heavens," Wimsey murmured, stepping into the confined space with practiced casualness. "You are, I trust, Edmund Chatterton. I must confess, the circumstances of you. Our accommodation are considerably more unpleasant than any I have previously encountered, though I suppose when one owes money to the wrong people, and one's sister proves insufficiently sympathetic to one's financial predicament, one must expect a certain decline in one's standard of living. The finger, I gather, was a sort of promissory note, a demonstration of your sister's willingness to cooperate with your creditors." Edmund Chatterton was a thin man, gaunt in a way that spoke of several days, reduced caloric intake combined with considerable emotional distress. His eyes, when they focused on Wimsey, held a peculiar mixture of relief and something that might have been shame. "She said," he began, his voice hoarse from disuse, "she said she'd do it herself rather than pay them. Said the money was mine to acquire and the consequences were mine to bear. She said if they wanted payment, they could have. He gestured weakly toward his bandaged right hand, where the wound had apparently been crudely dressed with surgical tape. Inspector Cordwell stepped forward with the practiced authority of his office. "You're saying your sister deliberately participated in the amputation of your finger? That she arranged this entire affair as a form of punishment?" "Not punishment," Wimsey said quietly, his eyes still fixed on Edmund's face with an intensity that suggested he was reading something written in invisible ink across the man's features. "Instruction. There is a considerable difference, Inspector. Mrs. Chatterton was not punishing her brother for his debt. She was communicating to his creditors that she was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to fulfill the payment arrangement, even if the payment itself came in the form of collateral. The finger is not merely a threat directed at Edmund. It is a promise directed at whoever holds his debt, a demonstration of commitment. Tell me, Edmund, how much precisely does your sister now owe these people? Or rather, how much does she believe she can acquire through the sale of her jewelry, the mortgaging of the hall, or whatever other resources she might muster?" Edmund's face crumpled slightly. £20,000. She said it was impossible. She said I'd made my bed and I must lie upon it. But when they came to her, when they explained what they would do if the money wasn't forthcoming, she said she would do it herself rather than let them damage me further. She brought a surgeon with her. They said it was the only way to prove to the lenders that she was serious. The implications of this statement hung in the cold cellar air like something tangible. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Cordwell that was entirely comprehensible. They had moved beyond simple assault or kidnapping into something considerably more complex. A conspiracy, perhaps, an arrangement between Mrs. Chatterton and her brother's creditors that had gone wrong, or perhaps had gone exactly as intended, but with consequences none of them had fully anticipated. Whimsy turned back to Edmund with a question that seemed almost casual in its inflection. When did your sister say she would be able to produce the £20,000? And more importantly, what did she propose to do with you in the interim? Surely keeping you locked in a cellar indefinitely is not a sustainable arrangement, particularly once the police become involved, as they inevitably would. Edmund's eyes flickered with something that might have been fear, or might have been resignation. She said 3 weeks. She said she would liquidate her securities and take out a loan against the estate. She said once the money was delivered, I would be released and we would both disappear for a time. She said they promised, the creditors promised, that once debt was satisfied, the matter would be closed permanently. Whimsy smiled, though there was nothing remotely pleasant about the expression. She said, 3 weeks. How remarkably specific, and how remarkably naive, if one may be permitted to observe. Tell me, Edmund, who are these creditors precisely? And, more importantly, has your sister mentioned having any contact with them since your confinement began? The names that Edmund provided were, in themselves, unremarkable. A London moneylender named Harrington and his associate, a man known only as Mr. Cole, who apparently handled the more physically demanding aspects of debt collection. What was remarkable, however, was Edmund's description of how the arrangement had been proposed. He had not, as one might expect, been approached directly by these individuals with threats of violence. Rather, they had approached his sister through an intermediary, a woman named Mrs. Verner, who had apparently presented herself as a representative of a charitable organization concerned with the welfare of debtors' families. It was Mrs. Verner who had suggested to Mrs. Chatterton that perhaps a symbolic gesture of commitment, a tangible proof of good faith, as it were, might expedite the resolution of the matter. Mrs. Verner, who had arranged for the surgeon, Mrs. Verner, who had apparently vanished immediately after the procedure was complete, leaving Mrs. Chatterton with a mutilated brother, a house full of servants who knew far more than was comfortable, and a deadline that now appeared considerably less negotiable than it had seemed in the abstract. "And you have not seen this Mrs. Verner since the amputation?" Whimsy inquired, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Edmund shook his head miserably. "Nor has your sister, I presume. No telephone calls, no messages, no contact whatsoever beyond the initial arrangement." Again, the negative. Whimsy rose from the chair he had not remembered sitting in, and began to pace the confined space with the air of a man engaged in particularly absorbing mental calculation. "Inspector, I wonder if you might arrange for discreet inquiries regarding Messrs. Harrington and Cole. I suspect you will find they are considerably less real than Mrs. Chatterton has been led to believe. Mrs. Verner, however, is almost certainly genuine, though I would wager a considerable sum that Mrs. Verner is not her actual name. What we appear to have here is a confidence scheme of remarkable sophistication. Your sister, Mr. Chatterton, has been systematically defrauded by persons unknown, who have taken advantage of her familial affection and her genuine concern for your welfare in order to extract precisely this sort of theatrical cooperation. The amputation, while undoubtedly real and undoubtedly painful, was almost certainly performed by an actual surgeon who believed himself to be part of a legitimate debt collection procedure. The entire affair has been designed to ensure that Mrs. Chatterton becomes an unwitting accomplice in what will undoubtedly be characterized as a crime of violence." Cordwell's expression darkened considerably as the implications became clear. "You're suggesting she's been made the tool of persons unknown? That the entire business was orchestrated specifically to compromise her?" "I am suggesting considerably more than that," Whimsy replied with the air of a man unveiling a particularly disagreeable truth. "I am suggesting that Mrs. Chatterton is not the primary victim here at all. She is merely the mechanism through which the real objective will be achieved. Consider who benefits from the existence of this severed finger. Not the moneylenders, They would prefer to remain unknown and unconnected to any violence. Not Edmund. He has been imprisoned and mutilated to no practical advantage. But Mrs. Chatterton benefits in a peculiar way. She becomes, through her own agency and her own moral compromise, a person with considerable motivation to cover up what has occurred. She becomes a person who will lie to the authorities, who will pay large sums of money to make the problem disappear, who will be fundamentally compromised and therefore controllable. The question is not who sent the finger, Inspector. The question is who sent it, and to what end. Sergeant Pettigrew, who had been taking notes with admirable diligence, looked up from his notebook with visible confusion. But if the whole thing was a scheme to compromise Mrs. Chatterton, what's the endgame? Blackmail, extortion, almost certainly, Whimsy agreed, though the nature of the blackmail may be considerably more specific than simple criminality. Tell me, Inspector, has anyone made contact with Mrs. Chatterton since the finger arrived? Any telephone calls, any visitors, any communications whatsoever that might constitute a demand for payment or discretion? Cordwell shook his head. Not that we've been made aware of, though admittedly, we've only been on the scene for approximately 90 minutes. Which means, Whimsy said with the air of someone reaching a rather uncomfortable conclusion, that the contact is forthcoming, probably within the next few hours. Whoever orchestrated this affair is allowing sufficient time for the initial shock to settle, for Mrs. Chatterton to make her initial report to the authorities, and for her to begin considering her options. Then, when she is maximally vulnerable and maximally desperate, the real demand will arrive, and that demand, I would warrant, has very little to do with money and considerably more to do with something else entirely. Perhaps information, perhaps access. Perhaps the simple fact that Mrs. Chatterton will be willing to commit any number of indiscretions in order to protect both her brother and her own reputation. He turned to address Edmund directly. I wonder if you might tell me whether your sister has any connection, however tangential, to matters of a financial or governmental nature, investments, trusts, any involvement whatsoever with institutions or individuals of note? Edmund's response came slowly, as though he were trying to recall details from a conversation he had only half attended. There is a trust, from Father's estate. She manages it rather carefully. There's also the house accounts. She controls the household purse strings. Why does that? He stopped, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. Good Lord. They don't want money at all, do they? They want access. Precisely, Whimsy said with grim satisfaction. They want access to whatever your sister controls. And they have orchestrated circumstances specifically designed to ensure that she will provide that access without truly understanding the implications of what she is doing. Which means, Inspector, that we must return to the house immediately. I suspect Mrs. Chatterton is about to receive a visitor, and I should very much like to be present when that visitor makes their intentions clear. Mrs. Chatterton was in the process of preparing to flee when they returned to the hall, which was precisely what Whimsy had anticipated, and precisely what he had hoped to prevent. She had begun with the smaller items, her jewelry, some documents from her desk, and a leather traveling case, into which she was carefully placing banknotes with the methodical precision of someone who had already decided that legal recourse was no longer a viable option. She looked up as they entered her sitting room with the expression of a person caught in the act of theft, though technically, Whimsy supposed, one could hardly be. Accused of stealing from oneself, Mrs. Chatterton, Cordwell said with the careful formality of a man about to make an arrest, I'm afraid I must ask you to remain available for further questioning regarding... But Whimsy raised a hand, silencing him with a sort of gesture that suggested he possessed information that the inspector did not yet have access to. She hasn't received the contact yet, Whimsy said, addressing the room rather than any particular individual. She's running not from the police, but from what she anticipates the police will discover if they remain here sufficiently long. The question is, Mrs. Chatterton, what precisely do you believe we will discover? And more importantly, what is it that you are attempting to prevent us from discovering by this precipitous departure? Mrs. Chatterton's composure, which had held remarkably well throughout the morning's proceedings, finally fractured. She sank into her chair with the air of a woman suddenly relieved of an unbearable weight. They said they would contact me, she said quietly. They said that once I understood the gravity of Edmund's situation, I would be more amenable to cooperation. They said I was to await their instructions. And you decided to flee rather than await those instructions, Whimsy observed. Why? What is it that they intend to ask of you that you find so objectionable that you are willing to abandon your home, your position, and potentially your brother to escape it? He settled into a chair across from her with the air of a man prepared to wait indefinitely for an answer. Or perhaps the better question is this: what is it that you possess that they want sufficiently badly to orchestrate an entire scheme around obtaining it? Not money. Edmund's debt, I suspect, is entirely fictional. Not information, precisely, though information is likely to be involved. Something tangible, something specific, something that you have not yet given them because you have not yet been directly asked. Mrs. Chatterton's hands trembled as she set down the banknotes she had been holding. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. My husband did not die of natural causes. That is what they know. That is what they are prepared to reveal if I do not cooperate. The statement hung in the air with the weight of genuine catastrophe. Cordwell's eyes narrowed, and Sergeant Pettigrew's pencil froze mid-note. Whimsy, however, merely tilted his head fractionally, as though considering this revelation from several different angles simultaneously. How very interesting, he murmured. Your husband, I gather, died approximately, what would you say, 5 years ago? 6? Some time sufficient for the matter to be buried beneath the accumulation of normal domestic life, yet recent enough that the circumstances remain within living memory. Tell me, was his death investigated at the time, or did it occur in such a manner that investigation was deemed unnecessary? He fell, Mrs. Chatterton said tonelessly. From the library window. They said it was suicide. He had been despondent about the state of his investments. The inquest concluded. She stopped, unable or unwilling to continue. But you were present, Whimsy said with certainty rather than as a question. You witnessed the fall, or you witnessed something that occurred immediately before or after the fall. And you have, for reasons that seemed compelling at the time, maintained a fiction regarding the actual circumstances of his death. Presumably because the alternative, the admission of whatever actually occurred, would have been considerably more damaging to you personally than merely allowing him to be characterized as a suicide. Mrs. Chatterton nodded miserably. I was there. I saw him. I saw him at the window. There was an argument. He had discovered that I had been removing money from the trust, small amounts, for years. He was going to inform the trustees. He was going to have me prosecuted. He went to the window in rage and I... She stopped, her hands gripping the arms of her chair with white-knuckled intensity. And you pushed him, Whimsy said softly. It was not a question, a simple matter of a hand placed firmly between the shoulders at a moment of maximum vulnerability. A man standing too close to an open window, already emotionally volatile, already off balance. No great force would be required. The fall itself would accomplish what you could not. 20 years of accumulated resentment, financial anxiety, and the certainty that your carefully constructed life was about to collapse, all resolved in a single moment of violence. It was an accident, Mrs. Chatterton whispered. I merely meant to. I didn't intend. You didn't intend for him to die, Whimsy interrupted. But you didn't particularly intend for him to live either. There is a considerable difference between commission and omission, though the law takes a rather dim view of both. And so you have spent the past 5 years living with that knowledge, secure in the belief that the matter was concluded, that no one would ever know, that the inquest had provided sufficient explanation for the world to move forward. But someone did know. Someone has always known, and they have waited patiently for the opportunity to use that knowledge to extract whatever it is they actually desire. Inspector Cordwell appeared torn between the desire to arrest Mrs. Chatterton immediately for her husband's death and the recognition that they were still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Mrs. Chatterton, he began, I must inform you of your rights. But again, Whimsy gestured for silence. Before we address the matter of her husband's death, he said, I should very much like to know who exactly knows about it, and more importantly, I should like to know what they intend to ask of her in exchange for their continued discretion. For that, I believe, is when the real crime was to occur. The telephone rang at precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which was either remarkable coincidence or rather more organized planning than one might have anticipated from persons engaged in criminal enterprise. Mrs. Chatterton made no move to answer it, and after the third ring, Whimsy rose with deliberate casualness and lifted the receiver himself, speaking into the instrument with the sort of cultivated drawl that suggested he was merely a house guest of no particular importance. The voice on the other end of the line was male, educated, and possessed of the sort of measured tone that one associates with individuals accustomed to obtaining precisely what they desire through verbal negotiation rather than through violence. "I should like to speak with Mrs. Chatterton," the voice said. There was no preamble, no identification, merely the simple demand delivered with the sort of certainty that suggested refusal was not considered a viable option. "I'm afraid Mrs. Chatterton is temporarily indisposed," Whimsy replied pleasantly. "However, I can assure you that we are in possession of the finger, and we are considerably interested in the remainder of your proposal. Might I inquire whether you intend to continue employing Mr. Edmund Chatterton as your primary leverage, or whether you have developed an alternative strategy for ensuring Mrs. Chatterton's cooperation?" There was a pause on the line, the sort of pause that suggested the speaker was rapidly reassessing his approach to a situation that had developed in an unexpected manner. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted fractionally, becoming something closer to genuine curiosity. "Who precisely am I speaking with?" "Lord Peter Whimsy," he replied, with the sort of casual certainty that suggested this was a name of considerable significance. "I am currently engaged as an unofficial consultant to the local police, who are, as I suspect you are already aware, conducting an investigation into the arrival of your rather theatrical calling card. I find myself developing the impression that you are a person of intelligence and discretion, qualities which suggest you might prefer to clarify your intentions through direct communication rather than through further escalation of this admittedly dramatic situation." Another pause, longer than the first. When the voice resumed, there was something almost amused in its inflection. "You are aware, I presume, that we hold information regarding Mrs. Chatterton's involvement in her husband's death?" "Entirely aware," Whimsy confirmed. "As, I suspect, are several other individuals, including myself, the local constabulary, and Mrs. Chatterton herself. The question that interests me considerably more is what you intend to do with that information, and precisely what you believe Mrs. Chatterton is capable of providing that would be worth her freedom from the threat of exposure. You see, I have developed a rather intriguing hypothesis regarding your entire operation. The amputation, the imprisonment, the theatrical delivery of the finger. All of these things are designed not to extract money, but to establish a particular pattern of behavior. You are attempting to demonstrate to Mrs. Chatterton that you are willing to commit acts of considerable violence in order to achieve your objectives. You are attempting to terrify her into cooperation. But you have made a rather fundamental error in your calculation. And what error would that be?" The voice held genuine curiosity now, tinged with something that might have been respect. "You have assumed that Mrs. Chatterton values her brother's welfare and her own reputation sufficiently highly to override her basic instinct for self-preservation," Whimsy said. "But a woman who has spent 5 years living with the knowledge that she has murdered her husband is not a woman possessed of particularly robust ethical sensibilities. More importantly, she is not a woman who will cooperate with blackmailers when cooperation merely delays the inevitable day of reckoning. You see, Mrs. Chatterton understands, or is rapidly coming to understand, that if she provides you with whatever it is you desire, she will have simultaneously provided you with evidence of additional criminality, additional leverage, additional ammunition for future demands. She would be trading one form of captivity for another." The line crackled with static for a moment. "I begin to understand why they say you have a reputation for solving murders, Lord Peter. What precisely are you proposing?" "I am proposing that you tell me who you actually are," Whimsy said with the sort of directness that suggested he had grown tired of verbal sparring. "Not the name you have been using, but your actual identity." I am proposing that you tell me what it is that you have been attempting to extract from Mrs. Chatterton. Once I possess that information, I will be in a position to determine whether your objectives are sufficiently sympathetic to warrant my intervention on your behalf, or whether they are sufficiently criminal to warrant my intervention on behalf of the Crown." There was a very long silence indeed. In that silence, Whimsy could almost hear the man on the other end of the line engaged in rapid mental calculation, weighing his options, considering his alternatives. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed entirely, the cultured tone stripped away, replaced by something considerably more raw and genuine. "My name is Robert Verner," the voice said, "and the woman you know as Mrs. Verner, the woman who arranged for the amputation of your Mr. Chatterton's finger, is my wife. She was, until 5 years ago, married to someone else. A man named Charles Chatterton, Mrs. Chatterton's husband. When Charles died, when he was murdered, the police concluded it was suicide. My wife and I have spent the past 5 years attempting to prove otherwise. We have evidence that Mrs. Chatterton forced her husband to the window. We have witnesses who suggest there was violence preceding the fall. But the inquest has closed, the body is buried, and the magistrate is not interested in reopening the case based on speculation. What we require from Mrs. Chatterton is a confession. Failing that, access to certain documents that might prove her guilt. We want justice for Charles, Lord Peter. We want the woman who murdered him to face appropriate legal consequences for her crime." Whimsy held the telephone receiver away from his ear for a moment, as though the revelation it contained required a brief interval of physical separation before it could be fully processed. Inspector Cordwell, standing at a discreet distance, but entirely capable of inferring the general thrust of the conversation from Whimsy's half of the dialogue, had developed the sort of expression that one associates with individuals confronted by the discovery that their investigation has taken an unexpected turn into considerably more morally ambiguous territory. When Whimsy replaced the receiver and turned to address the room, his customary ironic detachment had been replaced by something considerably closer to genuine thoughtfulness. "It appears," he said, settling back into his chair with deliberate casualness, "that we have been operating under a fundamental misapprehension regarding the nature and motivation of our perpetrators. What we have before us is not a straightforward case of criminal extortion or revenge, but rather something considerably more philosophically complex, namely, an attempt to achieve justice through extra-legal means by individuals who have exhausted the legitimate avenues available to them. Mr. Robert Verner was, until 5 years ago, married to the sister of Mrs. Chatterton's deceased husband. When Charles Chatterton died, Verner believed, indeed, appears to believe with considerable certainty, that his sister-in-law was responsible. The inquest concluded otherwise. The case was closed, and Verner, faced with what he perceived as a gross failure of the legal system, decided to take matters into his own hands. Mr. Chatterton's face had gone ashen. "They're going to expose me," she whispered. "They're going to ensure that I am prosecuted for Charles's death." "Very likely," Whimsy agreed with clinical precision, "though the question of whether they will be successful in that endeavor remains considerably more complex. You see, what Mr. Verner possesses is suspicion, circumstantial evidence, and the conviction born of familial loss. What he does not possess is proof sufficiently robust to convince a court of law to overturn an inquest that has been closed for 5 years. A confession would certainly accomplish that objective, which is undoubtedly why he orchestrated circumstances designed to terrify you into providing one. However, I find myself in possession of information that Mr. Verner does not yet have, and that information rather substantially complicates his entire enterprise." Inspector Cordwell leaned forward with the intensity of a man preparing to hear something of considerable professional importance. "And what information would that be, Lord Peter?" "The rather inconvenient fact," Whimsy said, "that Mrs. Chatterton is telling the truth regarding the circumstances of her husband's death, albeit not in the manner that Mr. Verner has assumed. She was present at the window. There was an argument, and Charles Chatterton did indeed fall, but the operative word is fall rather than was pushed. which means that either Mr. Werner has constructed an elaborate edifice of accusation based upon fundamentally erroneous assumptions, or Mrs. Chatterton is an even more accomplished liar than her 5 years of deception would suggest. Given that she has already confessed, albeit under duress, to involvement in the incident, I am inclined toward the former interpretation. Tell me, Mrs. Chatterton, precisely what was the nature of the argument that preceded your husband's death? R.S. Chatterton appeared momentarily paralyzed by the question, as though she were being asked to excavate events that had been deliberately buried beneath layers of protective denial. When she finally spoke, her words came haltingly, each one extracted with visible effort. He had discovered the theft from the trust. He was engaged in telephoning the trustees to arrange for my prosecution. I attempted to persuade him not to do so. I suggested that the money could be replaced gradually, that the matter need not become public. He refused. He said I had betrayed his trust. His personal trust, not merely the financial trust. He said I had made a mockery of our marriage. He became increasingly agitated. He moved toward the window as though he required air. He was standing at the sill, gesturing wildly, and She paused, her hands clenching. I reached out to steady him. I placed my hand on his shoulder, and he jerked away from my touch. He was not looking backward. He was looking out at the grounds. He simply went. Like a man stepping off a curb, as though he had forgotten there was anything beyond the window. The quality of this account possessed the unmistakable ring of genuine trauma, not the rehearsed narrative of someone who had spent years perfecting a false story, but rather the fractured recollection of someone attempting to describe an event that had never quite cohered into coherent memory. Wimsey exchanged a glance with Cordwell that required no verbal elaboration. They were in the presence of truth, or at least a version of truth, sufficiently complex that it existed in uncomfortable proximity to various forms of culpability, without necessarily constituting murder in any legal sense. So, you did not push him, Wimsey said quietly. But you did attempt to restrain him, and he did recoil from that restraint, and the recoil resulted in his falling. A distinction that a competent defense attorney would find considerably more compelling than Mr. Werner might anticipate. However, that is not the most interesting aspect of this revelation. The most interesting aspect is the question of why you did not share this version of events with the authorities at the time of the inquest. Why, instead, you allowed yourself to be characterized as merely a grieving widow, when the truth would almost certainly have exonerated you of any intentional wrongdoing. Mrs. Chatterton's voice, when she answered, was barely perceptible. Because I was stealing from the trust. Because I had been stealing for years. Because if the inquest had investigated the circumstances with any real rigor, they would have discovered the theft. And once they discovered the theft, my entire life, my social position, my reputation, everything I had constructed, would have been destroyed. The suicide narrative provided a way to close the matter without inquiry. Charles's death would be attributed to his own mental instability regarding his investments, rather than to his discovery of my criminality. I was protecting myself, not from accusations of murder, but from accusations of theft and infidelity and all the accumulated small cruelties that constitute an ordinary marriage. Wimsey rose from his chair and moved toward the window, his attention apparently divided between the autumn gardens beyond and some internal calculation of considerably greater complexity. Which means, he said finally, that Mr. Werner has spent 5 years attempting to prosecute a woman for a crime she did not commit, based upon evidence that would not have withstood even cursory examination had he possessed any genuine understanding of the domestic circumstances involved. The question now becomes what we do with that knowledge, and how we proceed in a manner that permits genuine justice. To be served, rather than merely the satisfaction of Mr. Werner's understandable but fundamentally misguided desire for vengeance. The matter of what one does with knowledge that implicates multiple parties in various forms of criminality, some of which constitute genuine legal violations while others exist in the more ambiguous territory of moral failing. is precisely the sort of problem that has occupied the attention of philosophers and magistrates since time immemorial, and Whimsy had learned through years of investigation that there is rarely a solution that satisfies all parties equally. He returned to the telephone at 4:30 and placed a call to the number from which Werner had contacted them, requesting that the man meet him at Chatterton Hall at 8 o'clock that evening. Werner's initial resistance dissolved into acceptance when Whimsy suggested that such a meeting might provide an opportunity to discuss evidence of considerably greater significance than anything thus far produced. Inspector Cordwell, meanwhile, was engaged in the delicate business of determining precisely what charges, if any, could be legitimately brought against Mrs. Chatterton for her theft from the trust, and her subsequent 5 years of knowing participation in the cover-up of circumstances surrounding her husband's death. The hours between Werner's agreement to meet and his actual arrival were spent in the sort of detailed reconstruction that Whimsy found considerably more satisfying than the initial discovery phase of investigation. He interviewed Graves regarding the precise condition of the household on the evening Charles Chatterton died. Had there been unusual agitation? Had servants observed raised voices? Had Mrs. Chatterton's behavior in the immediate aftermath seemed consonant with genuine grief, or with something more calculated? The butler's responses, carefully measured, and filtered through the particular discretion required of long-service household staff, painted a picture of a woman who had been shocked but not devastated, who had been concerned primarily with ensuring that no scandalous details emerged regarding her husband's state of mind. He reviewed the contemporary newspaper accounts of the inquest. 5 years of dust had obscured them considerably in Mrs. Chatterton's study, and found them precisely as Mr. Werner had characterized them: a verdict of suicide, a tragic loss, no mention whatsoever of the argument that had preceded it, and no investigation into the reason for that argument. By the time Robert Werner arrived at the hall, the evening had developed the sort of atmospheric quality that Whimsy privately associated with the Gothic tradition. Autumn fog rolling across the grounds, the windows rattling slightly in the wind, and the interior of the house illuminated by gaslight in a manner that rendered shadows considerably more prominent than was perhaps comfortable. Werner himself was a man of perhaps 45, with the sort of drawn features that suggest years of consuming resentment and obsessive preoccupation. He entered the drawing-room where Whimsy had arranged the meeting with the air of a man entering a battlefield, and his eyes immediately found Mrs. Chatterton, who was seated beneath a lamp with the appearance of someone who had reconciled herself to whatever outcome was forthcoming. "Before we proceed," Whimsy began, his tone suggesting that interruption was not considered a viable option, "I should like to establish precisely what Mr. Werner believes he possesses in terms of evidence regarding the death of Charles Chatterton. You mentioned witnesses, I believe? Persons who could testify that there was violence preceding the fall?" Werner produced a small notebook, from which he extracted several names and accompanying testimonies. A gardener who had heard raised voices from the library, a housemaid who had observed Mrs. Chatterton's distressed state in the minutes following the fall, a neighbor who had been passing the property and had heard what he characterized as a woman's cry of alarm. Nothing, Whimsy noted, with the sort of clinical precision that his profession required, that constituted actual proof of anything beyond the fact that an argument had occurred and that Mrs. Chatterton had been present. "And you have waited 5 years, Whimsy said, "conducting an investigation that the legally constituted authorities declined to pursue because you believed, indeed because you remain convinced, that justice has not been served. Tell me, Mr. Werner, what would constitute adequate justice in your estimation? A conviction of murder, a confession, a public acknowledgement that you were correct and that the inquest was in error?" Werner's jaw tightened. "Charles deserves justice. My sister deserves to know that her husband's death was not merely some tragic accident brought on by financial anxiety. He was murdered, and this woman," he gestured toward Mrs. Chatterton with undisguised contempt, "has been permitted to proceed with her life unpunished. But you see," Whimsy replied with a sort of gentle reasonableness that rendered his argument considerably more devastating than any amount of rhetoric could have managed, "that is precisely where your investigation has gone astray. Charles Chatterton was not murdered. He died as a result of his own voluntary action, a recoil born of emotional disturbance admittedly, but nonetheless voluntary. Mrs. Chatterton's involvement in his death consisted of attempting to prevent that recoil, not of causing it. As for punishment, he turned his attention toward Mrs. Chatterton. I suspect the punishment she has inflicted upon H. Herself through 5 years of guilt, anxiety, and the constant threat of exposure is rather more severe than any magistrate would impose. However, there is a matter of genuine criminality that remains to be addressed. He paused, allowing the weight of that statement to settle. The theft from the trust. That is a crime for which Mrs. Chatterton bears unambiguous responsibility. That is a crime for which she should face legal consequences. And that is a crime which Mr. Werner, in his obsessive pursuit of a murder that never occurred, has entirely overlooked. Inspector Cordwell, I believe you have sufficient evidence now to proceed with charges regarding the embezzlement of trust funds. Mr. Werner, I suggest you redirect your considerable energies toward ensuring that the actual perpetrator of financial wrongdoing is appropriately punished by the law, rather than continuing to pursue vengeance for a death that was neither murder nor manslaughter, but merely a tragedy born of human frailty and miscommunication.